Welcome to Midnight Casebook, where every shadow hides a secret and every mystery begs to be solved. Tonight, we unravel the chilling tale of Father Brown and Only. Shadows answered his prayer, a fan-made story paying homage to the brilliance of G.K., Chesterton's legendary detective. We'd love to have you along for this enigmatic journey. Drop a comment to let us know where you're watching from. Share your theories, and if you spot any inconsistencies, don't hesitate to call them out. Your keen eyes and sharp minds help us craft even more captivating mysteries in the future. Chapter 1. Father Brown vanishes without a trace. They found the confessional empty, the door ajar, and the floor beneath it soaked with blood that didn't belong to anyone in the village. Father Brown had vanished, without a sound, without a note, and without a trace, and the last person to see him alive insists he never walked into the church at all. In Kembleford, nothing ever happens, at least not the sort of things that leave priests missing and blood where silence should be. But this morning, the fog didn't lift, the bells didn't ring, and the parishioners stood at the chapel doors with their heads bowed, not in prayer, but in fear. Because when Mrs. Dalloway came to open the church at 6, she found the holy place desecrated. One candlestick toppled, 2 pews shifted just slightly as though something had been dragged across the floor. But worst of all was the crimson pooling in the dark stone corner by the altar, a smear of it along the inside of the confessional door, too high for a wound from the knee, too clean for an accident, and no Father Brown. The bishop was notified. The local police searched every path, stream, and barn for miles. His shoes were still by the vestry door. His cassock hung on its usual hook. But the man himself, his soft voice, his quiet step, his penetrating eyes, was gone. No footprints, no carriage, no witness. Just an empty church and blood that no one could explain. And then came the letter. No address, no return stamp, just the words. The priest knew too much. When the inspector read that line aloud, even the candlelight seemed to recoil. What could Father Brown have known? He listened to confessions, certainly. He heard what others were not meant to hear. But he was a man of discretion, of mercy, of patience, not the kind to blackmail, not the kind to judge. And yet someone had judged him, silenced him, or worse. The village turned inward after that. Doors shut earlier, windows locked. People began looking at one another too long, too closely. Secrets, which had long nestled comfortably under floorboards and behind hedgerows, began to stir. Whispers surfaced. Mrs. Fielding said she'd heard Father Brown arguing with someone in the graveyard 2 nights before he disappeared. Raised voices, hushed threats. Mr. Howe, the undertaker, claimed the priest had requested access to the mausoleum at midnight for spiritual reasons, but he hadn't explained more than that. And then there was Miss Eliza Hart, who insisted Father Brown had recently destroyed one of his own journals, burning it completely in the fireplace without reading it, weeping as he did so. Everyone had a piece of the mystery, but none of the pieces fit together. Not in the way they should. There was no logic, no line from motive to action. And that was what made it unbearable. This wasn't a murder with fingerprints. This was something else, something designed to leave the village spinning. And then, 3 nights after his disappearance, the church bell rang again. At precisely 3 a.m., a time no one would dare walk the grounds, it sounded once. No one admitted to hearing it ring in person. No one saw the bell rope move. But it rang, and when Mrs. Dalloway entered the chapel the next morning, she found a single candle lit, its wax dripping in, a perfectly straight line, and beside it, on the altar, a scrap of parchment with the words, "It wasn't supposed to end like this." The handwriting did not match Father Brown's, nor did it match the anonymous letter. It was then the inspector began to believe that Father Brown had been on the verge of something, that his disappearance wasn't random, but part of a puzzle too big for anyone else to see. They reopened his rooms at the rectory and found them untouched. But in the drawer, beneath his bed, lay a single page torn from a Bible. Matthew 10:26. For there is nothing concealed that will not be disclosed, or hidden that will not be made known. It was underlined in red ink, except no one could find a red pen anywhere in the house. The more they searched, the deeper the hole became. It turned out Father Brown had made several inquiries in the weeks leading up to his disappearance. He had requested transcripts of death certificates going back 20 years. He had visited the asylum outside of Gloucester under a false name. He had paid visits to the families of 3 different men, each of whom had died on the same day of the month, the 12th. When someone tried to look up the exact cause of their deaths, the records were blurred, faded, water-damaged, all 3. And the registrar who had filled them out was later declared missing, presumed drowned. There were no bodies. The inspector asked Father Brown's closest friend, Mrs. McCarthy, what he might have been investigating. She went pale and refused to speak. But later, when pressed, she said this: "He told me once, a month ago, that there were things even God hadn't forgiven yet. Things buried not by time, but by people who pretend they have nothing to hide." She didn't elaborate, but someone did. A week later, a child named Arthur, only 7, came into the police station holding a toy box. He said he had found it in the woods behind the rectory. The toy box contained no toys. It held only a pair of Father Brown's spectacles, cracked at the rim, and a second letter. It had only 3 words, "He's still listening." The words were burned into the paper, scorched, not written. No fingerprints, no ash, and no explanation. Was Father Brown dead? If he was, why leave these clues? If he wasn't, why vanish without a trace? The entire mystery began to collapse in on itself. Nothing made sense. Every answer raised 3 new questions. The people Father Brown had trusted most now seemed like strangers. The villagers who had confessed their sins to him began to wonder if those secrets had come at too high a cost. And then the first body turned up. It wasn't Father Brown. It was Violet Green, the woman who ran the flower stall outside the church. She had been missing since the day after Father Brown vanished, but no one had thought much of it. Her body was found in the crypt behind the chapel, tucked neatly into a corner, covered with a shroud made from a choir robe. Her hands were folded in prayer. Her mouth had been sewn shut. In her pocket, a torn piece of sheet music with the words, "He knows what you did." The villagers panicked. The theory was simple. Someone had gone mad. A killer, a vigilante, a priest who'd snapped, or someone who believed they were continuing his work. But the pattern didn't hold. Violet had no enemies. She'd lived quietly, loved her flowers, and cared for her disabled brother. She had no known secrets, unless Father Brown had discovered one. And then someone remembered something. 3 years ago, a local girl had vanished. Sarah Hemsworth, 16. No leads, no body. But Father Brown had never let it go. And Violet had been the last person to speak with Sarah the night she disappeared. The theory twisted again. Maybe Father Brown had found the truth about Sarah. Maybe he confronted Violet. Maybe Violet confessed and died for it. Or maybe someone silenced her before she could tell anyone else. But then again, maybe Violet wasn't the only one who knew. Maybe someone else had heard that confession. Or maybe no one heard it at all. And maybe that was the problem. Because you see, confessions are meant to be private. They're sacred. But if someone wanted that confession to be known, if someone forced it out of her, then Father Brown wasn't the only one listening that night in the church. He had vanished. But the real question wasn't where he'd gone. It was who was pretending to be him. Because by the time the second murder occurred, a young man crucified in the bell tower, the police realized something terrifying. The messages hadn't stopped. The letters kept arriving, each signed with the same phrase, in his name, but none were written in Father Brown's handwriting. None used his seal. None bore his cross. And Father Brown, the man who never missed a sermon, never left a door unlocked, never let evil go unspoken, had never written a single word of them. Not one. Because Father Brown was gone. And the killer wrote no letter. They didn't need to. Chapter 2. She died before confessing everything. The woman died mid-sentence, her mouth frozen around a name she never managed to say. And now Father Brown knows that whoever killed her was standing in that room, listening, waiting for her silence. They said Margaret Temple had been ill for years. Whispers of fainting spells, strange fevers, visions and voices had chased her name through the corridors of Kembleford's village gossip like shadows at dusk. But to Father Brown, she was just Margaret, lonely, deeply religious, and always sitting in the back pew, whispering prayers no one else understood. She rarely spoke, but last week she did something no one expected. She asked for confession. The request itself wasn't unusual, but what made it strange, what made Father Brown hesitate, was how she asked. Not with humility, not with desperation, but with fear, as if she thought the very act of speaking might summon something she'd buried too long. She was trembling before she even began, and the words that followed felt rehearsed, like she'd written them in her mind 1,000 times and never said them aloud until now. She began with fragments, a name from the past, a place near the river, a night where something went horribly wrong. But just as she leaned forward and said, "It was never just me. He was with me." And then her voice cracked. She clutched her chest and collapsed. Father Brown caught her, cried out, called for help. But by the time the doctor arrived, she was gone. Just like that. No warning, no second breath, no final word. And whoever he was, that name she was trying to say, it died with her. Only it didn't end there. Later that night, Father Brown found something disturbing in the confessional. Hidden in the wall, behind a loose wooden panel, was a small bundle wrapped in black cloth. Inside, an old rosary, frayed and blood-stained. A photograph torn in half, Margaret on one side, a man's hand, gripping her shoulder on the other. And a note, no signature, no address, just a line in hurried ink. "She knows. Stop her before she speaks." The paper was aged, watermarked. It wasn't written last week or last month. This message had been hidden for years, which meant someone else knew she might speak. Someone who feared it, and that someone had been in the church recently. But what truly disturbed Father Brown wasn't the note, it was the photograph, the torn half with the hand, because something about the sleeve, The cut of the coat, the glint of a ring, was oddly familiar. He couldn't place it, not yet, but it unsettled him deeply. The next day, Mrs. McCarthy mentioned a curious thing. She said Margaret had once confessed something to her by accident. Something about the drowning boy. She hadn't known what to make of it at the time. She thought Margaret was rambling, possibly confusing past with present. But now, in the wake of her sudden death, the phrase felt loaded. Father Brown began his own search. He combed through old newspapers. He spoke to families long moved away. And then he found it, a small article buried in a decades-old village gazette. Young boy drowns in 7. No foul play suspected. Witness, Margaret Temple, age 19. That was the headline. But the body of the article was stranger. It mentioned that the boy, Thomas Harker, was seen entering the water with 2 other people. Margaret was one, the other, unnamed, unidentified, because no one ever came forward. No one ever admitted to being there with them. Father Brown felt a chill. That was it. That was the memory Margaret had been carrying, the sin she had tried to unburden. But if she had only been a witness, why had she trembled so violently in the confessional? Why the blood on the rosary? Why the note threatening her life? He returned to the riverbank, where the boy had drowned. The reeds had grown, taller, but the place was unchanged. Quiet, still. And then he noticed something carved into the bark of a nearby oak tree. 3 initials, T.H., M.T., and R.W. 3 people. Father Brown's breath caught. Margaret was M.T. Thomas Harker was T.H. So who was R.W.? He scoured the parish records, found nothing under those initials, not until he checked the school register from the same year. There he found it. Richard Willoughby, a boy who vanished the same year Thomas drowned. The official story. His family moved abroad. No forwarding address, no goodbye, just gone. But something else caught his eye. Richard's father, Edward Willoughby, had been the chief constable at the time, which meant if something had happened, if Richard had been involved in Thomas's death, his father had the power to bury it, to erase it. And Margaret, she was the last person alive who could have exposed it. Until now. That night, Father Brown returned to the confessional alone. He lit a candle, opened the small bundle again, and stared at the torn photograph. The man's ring, the coat sleeve. It all came back in a wave of memory. Edward Willoughby had worn a coat just like that. Not his son. Him. Which changed everything. Because if Edward had placed that hand on Margaret's shoulder, not Richard, then it wasn't a boy she feared. It was the father, the man in power. And now, long after retirement, Edward Willoughby still lived, just outside of town, reclusive, widowed, ill, but not dead, not yet. Father Brown paid him a visit, a quiet afternoon, tea served by a nervous housemaid. Edward, now grey and pale, smiled with the slow charm of a man who believes time has erased all debts. "I suppose you're here about Margaret," he said softly. Father Brown didn't blink. She died before she could confess everything. Edward's eyes twitched, just once. How convenient. There was a pause. Then the old man leaned forward. "Father," he whispered, "do you know what happens when a secret dies with its keeper?" Father Brown said nothing. "It rots. It doesn't disappear. It festers, seeps into the ground, into the blood of everything nearby. That's why this village is sick, Father. Why people go mad. Why children vanish. The truth here has never been buried properly. Just swallowed. And some things," he said with a cold smile, "should stay swallowed." Father Brown stood, heart pounding. "Did you kill her?" The old man laughed. "I didn't need to." Margaret died of fear, and fear, Father Brown, is the most obedient killer of all. But before Father Brown could leave, Edward Willoughby added one last thing. She wasn't the only one who knew. Father Brown turned. Edward's smile vanished. "But I don't think you're ready to know who the third person was." "The third?" He meant R.W. the boy? Or, no, not Richard, not a boy, not even a man. Father Brown thought back to the initials on the tree. What if R.W. didn't stand for Richard Willoughby at all? What if it was Rebecca Wainwright, the midwife, the same woman who delivered Margaret's stillborn child 6 months after the drowning? A child no one ever mentioned. A child Father Brown never even knew existed. But if that child had died, and if Thomas had drowned, and if Margaret had known something that could destroy the Willoughbys, then maybe someone had switched the babies. Maybe Thomas hadn't drowned. Maybe he had lived, but under another name. And if that were true, Father Brown froze. Because the man standing in his chapel just the day before, the stranger who'd asked about Margaret, claimed to be a visiting historian, had worn a silver cross on his neck, the same one from the photograph. And he had asked one thing, and one thing only. Did Margaret ever mention the river? He had left before anyone could ask his name. And now, Father Brown looked down at the rosary again. This wasn't just a murder. This was a buried identity, a switched child, a web of lies stretching back decades. And the only person who could have confirmed any of it had died before confessing everything. Chapter 3, The Prayer That Summoned Death. She whispered the Lord's Prayer backward inside the chapel, and 5 minutes later, the organist dropped dead where he stood, his eyes wide open and his lips mouthing something that no one could hear. It should have been an ordinary evensong at St. Martin's, a quiet Thursday service. No thunder, no drama, just the usual handful of villagers, the scent of old wood and candle wax, and Mrs. Netherby at the organ, playing with a kind of weary grace she'd perfected over the last 20 years. Father Brown had noticed the girl the moment he stepped into the church. She wasn't from the village. Her hair was raven black, her dress out of place, too modern for the countryside. She sat in the front pew, alone, unmoving, hands clasped too tightly, staring at the altar like she expected something to bleed. It was during the third hymn that it happened. No sound, no scream. Just a sudden gasp from the front row and the eerie whine of the organ stopping mid-chord as if it had choked. When Father Brown turned, Mrs. Netherby was slumped forward on the keys, a single note screeching until someone had the presence of mind to pull her away. She was already dead. The doctor arrived 10 minutes later, shaking his head with confusion. No signs of trauma, no heart condition, no prior illness. It was as if she had just ceased. But Father Brown saw something the doctor didn't. As they moved the body, her right hand fell open, revealing a torn piece of paper crushed in her palm. A prayer, written in red ink. Only it wasn't quite right. The words were jumbled, flipped. Our Father, which art in hell. It was deliberate, a reversal, a desecration. And the girl, she was gone. She had slipped away during the confusion, unnoticed. No one remembered her name. No one had seen her arrive. But in the confession booth, Father Brown found her scent. Something faint and strange, like lilies and burnt dust. He said nothing to the others, not yet. But in the silence of his study that night, he remembered something he'd heard as a young seminarian. A legend, nothing more. A prayer so corrupted that its utterance wasn't a plea for protection, but an invitation. Not for salvation, but for judgment. He returned to the church alone after midnight. The pews creaked under invisible weight. The candles had all burned low, though none had been lit since the service. In the pulpit, he found a second torn paper, folded into the shape of a cross, wedged beneath the Bible. It wasn't the same prayer. This one read, "What was buried under the nave has begun to stir." He didn't sleep. The next day, he began to ask questions. He visited the church records, the dusty logs no one had read in decades, and what he found was chilling. St. Martin's had once been built over a different structure, a medieval chapel, long forgotten, and beneath the current floor, accessible only through a sealed stone trapdoor in the nave, was a burial vault, one that had never been opened. The log noted a warning, hastily scrawled in the margin. Consecrated, yes, but never exorcised. The church elders had buried something beneath the altar, and no one knew what. Father Brown requested the key. The bishop refused. 2 days later, the second death occurred. Thomas Cleary, the choir director, was found in his cottage, face pale, lips blue, clutching his prayer book as if it had failed him. His fireplace was cold, the windows unbroken, but there was blood under his nails, as though he had scratched at something just before dying. Something invisible. On the wall above him, someone had drawn a crude eye in charcoal, and beneath it, he sees through the veil. By now, panic had set in. Villagers stopped coming to the church. The old women crossed themselves twice when they passed the lich gate, and at night, no one walked near the chapel, but Father Brown did. And he wasn't alone, because on the third night, she returned. The girl in black. He found her kneeling at the altar, eyes closed, lips moving, praying or unpraying. He stepped quietly behind her. "You're calling something," he said. She didn't open her eyes. "I'm calling what was already here," she replied. "What is it you want?" To finish what she started. "Who?" She opened her eyes slowly. "My mother." The name she gave was Eliza Netherby, daughter of the organist. She hadn't just come to the church that night by chance. She had come because she believed her mother had finally broken, cracked under the weight of what she had hidden. And her death, according to the girl, wasn't natural. She was the first to pray it, the girl said. Backward, on the night they sealed the vault, and it never let her go. Father Brown tried to reason with her, tried to bring her back to truth, to logic, to the light of the faith he'd carried for so long. But she only smiled. "It's not about belief," she whispered. "It's about invitation." That night, Father Brown forced the issue. He returned to the church, tools in hand, and pried open the stone trapdoor beneath the nave. The air that came out wasn't dust. It was cold, wet. It moved like breath. He descended alone. Beneath the chapel lay a narrow vault, lined with crumbling stones. In the center, a single coffin, sealed with iron bands and covered in centuries of grime. There was no name, no dates, just a symbol, an inverted cross inside a circle of fire. Father Brown lit a candle. Then he noticed the scratch marks along the lid. From the inside, he did not open it. He dared not. Instead, he knelt and prayed the right way. The next day, the girl was gone again. But so was the coffin. Vanished. Only the marks remained. And in the pulpit, A third note. No prayer this time. Only a sentence. You're too late. It's been answered. The villagers believe the deaths are over, that whatever evil was awakened has retreated. But Father Brown knows better, because last night, when he lit the sanctuary lamp, the flame bent sideways toward the old confessional, and for the briefest moment he saw her face, not the girl's, her mother's, eyes black, mouth moving, whispering a prayer that should never be spoken again. And this time he heard the ending, the part that always came too late. Deliver us into darkness. He knows what it means. He knows who it's for. And he knows now. The prayer that summoned death wasn't finished yet. Chapter 4. No one believed Father Brown. The first time Father Brown said the killer was in the congregation, they laughed. By the second time, the laughter stopped, because one of them was already dead. It began on a Sunday so ordinary it almost masked the rot underneath. The church bells rang like they always did. The hymns rose from the pews with practiced mediocrity, and the same 8 villagers sat in their usual spots, as if assigned by fate. The sun fell through stained glass onto Father Brown's vestments, casting patterns of martyrdom and redemption. He looked out at his congregation and saw a lie. It wasn't the kind of lie that shows in the eyes or trembles in the hands. It was the kind that seeps out through the silences, the long pauses when names are spoken, the glances that dart away too quickly. And then, when he stepped into the pulpit, he knew something had changed. Someone was hiding something. The death of Arthur Greaves had been declared tragic accident, a stroke in his sleep. Peaceful, they said. The doctor certified it, the widow wept, and the village moved on. But Father Brown couldn't forget one thing. The man had confessed to him 3 days earlier, trembling, sweating, unable to look him in the eye. I did something terrible, Arthur had said. Years ago. I thought it was buried, but someone knows. He never said more. And now he was dead. The second death followed, just 6 days later. Helen Cartwright, the schoolteacher, found at her desk with a broken neck. The constable claimed it was a fall. Her heel caught the rug, he said. But Father Brown had visited her that morning. She had been jumpy, pale, and she had asked in a whisper, "Do you think God punishes secrets even if they're old?" The village chalked it up to coincidence. 2 elderly people gone in 1 week. Nothing unusual. Life had its way, they said. But Father Brown saw the thread. Both had attended the same church. Both had been close to each other 30 years ago. And both had come to him, shaken with guilt. He told the police. He told the bishop. He told anyone who would listen. But no one believed Father Brown. He stood at Arthur's graveside, rain soaking through his cassock, and watched the villagers whisper behind gloved hands. They thought he was losing his mind. Mrs. Doyle muttered it to her sister. Young Ben Ridley refused to take communion, claiming Father Brown had gone strange. Even Inspector Mallory dismissed him with a tired wave. "Stick to prayers, Father. We'll handle the murders." "Murder?" Father Brown had asked. "You said they were accidents." And that was when Mallory's smile dropped, because he hadn't said murder. Not out loud, and then the third body turned up. Geoffrey Stokes, the village carpenter, hung by his own belt in the vestry, and written on the wall, in red chalk, "The weight of silence breaks the back." This time, even Mallory couldn't pretend it was coincidence. The doors were locked, no sign of forced entry, and yet the killer had come, written his message, and vanished. Father Brown asked for one thing: to speak from the pulpit, not with a sermon, but with a warning. They let him. He stood there beneath the vaulted roof of stone and said, "There is a pattern here, a sin that was shared, and it's unraveling now, person by person. These are not random acts. They are confessions, written in blood." And still, no one came forward. That night, Father Brown sat in his rectory alone, the candles flickering against the storm outside, and read through the parish records from 30 years ago. He found it. A date, a forgotten baptism, cancelled. No explanation. The child's name blacked out. But why? He returned to the chapel, drawn by something he couldn't name. He checked the old prayer book that Arthur Greaves had used. Folded between its pages was a torn page from a diary. The handwriting belonged to Helen. "We never should have agreed. The child was alive. He was breathing. But they said it would ruin everything. And Arthur swore he saw the mother again last week. She's come back. I can't bear it any more. The child, alive, buried secret. And now, the mother had returned." Father Brown felt the ground shift beneath his feet. Was this what they were hiding? A child they claimed had died. A mother whose name had been struck from the records. He searched the visitor logs, the donation slips, even the funeral guest books. And there she was, in fine script, 4 weeks earlier. Elena Wright, a name not heard in Kembleford in 30 years. And suddenly, it all made sense. She had returned to claim her truth, and those who had buried it were being buried in turn. The next morning, he visited the asylum in Gloucester. An old woman sat staring through the window, humming a hymn out of tune. Elena Wright. She turned when he said her name and whispered, "They took him from me." She spoke in fragments, half mad, but her pain was sharp and lucid. "They said he died, but I heard him cry. Arthur, Helen, Geoffrey. They lied. They said it was a mercy. They said no one could know." "What happened to your child?" Father Brown asked gently. "He's still here," she whispered. "He never left. He sees them now." Father Brown returned to the village with a new theory, one the police would never entertain. What if the killer wasn't an outsider? What if he was the child they buried in secret, raised under another name? What if he had grown up right here in Kembleford? Someone they saw every day, someone no one suspected. Father Brown began watching the congregation closely, noticing patterns, the way certain men flinched when Eleanor's name was mentioned, the way some eyes avoided the altar. And then, one night, he followed someone, a man who always sat near the back, quiet, kind, helpful. The gravedigger, George Lyle, unmarried, mid-30s, never missed a service. He lived alone in a cottage by the cemetery. And when Father Brown entered the yard that night, he saw light through the curtains and heard crying, not from pain, from guilt. George didn't deny it, not right away. He sat with Father Brown in silence. Then he said, "I always wondered why I was so angry, why I never fit, why the dreams came. And then one day, she walked past, the woman from my dreams, and everything snapped into place. You knew. I didn't know the truth until Arthur told me. He drank too much, said too much. He told me I was the child, that my birth was a mistake they tried to erase. And so you made them confess." George's eyes filled with tears. "I didn't want to kill them. I just wanted them to say it, to admit what they did. But they refused. They lied even as they died. Father Brown placed a hand on his shoulder. "What will you do now?" And George said, "Nothing. It's done." But the next morning, the chapel bell rang without wind, and George Lyle was found kneeling at the altar, dead. In his hand, a confession. But no one believed Father Brown. Not when he told them that George hadn't killed himself. Not when he said there was one more name on that diary page. One more conspirator. One who had stayed silent while the others fell. And who now had erased George to protect herself. But the village moved on. Called it justice, closure. Because no one believed Father Brown. Not then. Not even when the candles flickered without cause. Not even when the last name appeared, scrawled in ash on the chapel floor. And not even when he whispered, standing alone in the dark, "I know who did it." But the truth will never be told. Chapter 5. He heard. Murder during confession. "I killed him, and I'd do it again if I had the chance." Those were the first words Father Brown heard from behind the veil, and they nearly stopped his heart. It was a grey, humid Thursday evening when the confessional door creaked open, one of those sullen village days where the air feels too still and the birds too quiet. He'd just finished evening prayers. The candles burned low. The nave sat in silence. And then the whisper. Soft, low, steady. At first, Father Brown thought it was a prank, a boy testing the boundaries of sanctity. But the voice wasn't youthful. It was aged, calm, and terrifyingly sure of itself. "He didn't scream," the penitent said. "He looked at me like I wasn't real, like he'd already seen death. Isn't that funny?" The silence stretched. The candle behind the curtain flickered. Father Brown swallowed, heart racing. "You are in the presence of God," he said gently. "If you have sinned, he will hear your repentance, but you must confess in truth." "Oh, I am confessing," the voice replied. "I just want to see if he forgives people like me." The veil moved as if someone had shifted on the other side. Then, "You'll find him beneath the well." And the door clicked open, footsteps, silence. When Father Brown finally emerged from the booth, the church was empty. The candles had burned down to their stumps. Outside, the wind picked up and howled through the trees like a warning. And suddenly, the air in the church felt wrong, like something sacred had been violated. That night, Father Brown didn't sleep. By morning, the police were involved. Someone had dug up the well behind the old boarding school, and inside, buried in a shallow grave, they found a body, male, mid-40s, blunt force trauma to the skull. His name was Leonard Pike, missing for 7 years. His wife had remarried. The case was cold. No one had even looked for him anymore, but now he had returned, dragged back into the living world, not by chance, but by a confession. And that confession, by every tenet of Father Brown's faith, must remain sealed. He couldn't tell the police what he'd heard. He couldn't reveal the killer's name. Even though he now knew someone in his own village had gotten away with murder and might not be finished. The villagers began to whisper, "Why now? Why here? Was it suicide? Was it revenge?" And Father Brown watched, listened, studied the faces of those who came to Mass and those who didn't, who walked past the chapel quickly, who asked questions, and who never said a word. He started noticing patterns. Mrs. Harriet Pike, Leonard's widow, hadn't attended service in over a month. Her new husband, Gerald Flint, was a devout churchman, but lately He avoided Father Brown's gaze. And there was something odd about Gerald. His hands trembled during communion. He flinched when the word murder was mentioned. But Father Brown knew guilt came in layers. Gerald might be hiding something, but that didn't make him the killer. Then there was Matthew Dray, the groundskeeper. He lived near the school, knew every inch of that well, claimed he'd never seen anything strange. But he drank. He muttered to himself, and one morning he left a bottle of whiskey on the church steps with a single word scrawled in chalk. Forgive. 2 nights later, Father Brown received a letter, no return address, no signature, just a page torn from a hymn book with a sentence scrawled in red. He was not the first. The next day, another body turned up, buried in the orchard behind the vicarage. A woman this time. Name unknown, age unknown, bones old. She'd been there for decades. The police called it unrelated. But Father Brown saw the link. The orchard had once been part of the boarding school grounds, and the school, it had burned down 15 years ago in a mysterious fire that started in the headmaster's office, a fire that killed 2 staff members and a child. Too many deaths, too many silences, and one murderer who had returned to confess, not because of guilt, but because they wanted to be heard, wanted to be recognized. Father Brown scoured the school archives. He found it. An incident report, filed by a former teacher, handwriting shaky. Statement brief. Mr. Pike saw what he should not have. He was told to stay silent. He didn't. And beneath it, a redacted line. Father Brown stared at that line for hours. Then he realized something. He had seen that handwriting before, on the hymn book, and again, on the bottle at the steps. Matthew Dray, the groundskeeper. But why confess? Why now? Unless he wasn't the killer, unless he knew who was, and was being hunted too. That night, Father Brown visited Matthew. He found the man drunk, weeping, alone. They're coming for me. Next, he said. Who? They know I saw it. I tried to forget, but you opened it again. What did you see? Matthew looked at him, wild-eyed. Leonard found out about the fire, about the child. It wasn't an accident. The fire, it was started to hide what they did to her. That poor girl. She died begging them to stop. And Leonard, he was going to go to the police. And who stopped him? Matthew fell silent. Then, you already know. The next morning, Matthew was dead, poisoned. The police said suicide, but Father Brown saw the signs. The cup was planted. The ink on the note didn't match his usual scrawl. And the handwriting? Father Brown recognized it, identical to the note he had found in the confessional. The killer was framing their witnesses, silencing those who might expose them. And there was only one person left alive who could answer the rest. Gerald Flint. Father Brown invited him to tea, asked him gently about his past, his wife, her late husband, the school, and Gerald finally broke, not with words, but with tears, and a single question. If your faith told you someone deserved to die, would you forgive the person who carried it out? That was enough. Father Brown didn't need a confession now. He already had one. Unspoken. Delivered in silence. But the next day, before the police could act, Gerald disappeared. Gone. No trace. Just an empty house. And a final note left, behind, on the altar. I confess, but not to man, only to him. The town believed it was over. that the ghosts had been laid to rest. But Father Brown knew better, because when he sat in the confessional the following week, waiting in silence, another voice came through, not Gerald's, a woman's, soft, familiar. I told him what to do. I showed him the matches. I held the child down, but it was my husband who struck the first blow. Father Brown held his breath. She continued. They all did it, all of them, and now they're all dead, except for one. Who? Father Brown whispered. She laughed. Me. And then the voice vanished. No footsteps, no door creak, just silence. Father Brown opened the curtain. The confessional was empty, but on the floor there lay a single matchstick, unlit. And for the first time in his life, Father Brown didn't know whether to pray for justice or mercy, because he knew the true killer had never left, and perhaps never would. He closed the curtain again and whispered into the dark, I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 6. A Killer Sat in Church. The moment the choir hit the final note of Ave Verum Corpus, the man in the third pew unclasped his hands, stood up, and walked out, leaving behind a blood-stained glove tucked under the kneeling bench. No one saw him place it there. No one noticed his hands shaking during the sermon. No one heard the soundless whisper that passed his lips when Father Brown mentioned mercy. But Father Brown saw the glove, and in that instant he knew someone had just come to pray after a murder. The church had been full that morning. Families, visitors. Rain beat softly against the stained glass windows, and the smell of candle wax and wet coats filled the air. It had felt almost peaceful until the discovery. Father Brown had been clearing the pews after Mass, alone. The glove was fine leather, old-fashioned, and stained with something dark and drying. Not red like wine, but darker, thicker, more real. He wrapped it in his handkerchief. He didn't call the police, not yet. He needed to think, needed to understand. That night, the constable knocked on the rectory door with a grim face and a question. Did you know a Miss Lucinda Sharp? Father Brown nodded slowly. Yes. She lit candles every Sunday. Row 4, end seat. She's dead, the constable said. Found her in her kitchen. Neck broken, no signs of robbery, no struggle. The constable didn't notice Father Brown stiffen. He didn't see the way the priest's eyes flicked to the wrapped glove, still hidden in the drawer behind him. He only said, If you hear anything strange, Father, let us know. But Father Brown already had. Someone had brought their guilt to church. He spent the next 2 days walking the village, observing, not accusing, listening, quietly. And one question echoed through his mind. Why would a killer come to church? Was it arrogance, a plea for forgiveness, or a challenge? He noticed subtle things, tiny inconsistencies. Mr. Hargreaves, who never came to Mass, had sat in the 4th pew that morning, exactly where Lucinda had always prayed. Why? Mrs. Delaney, the florist, had arrived early and sat in the back. Unusual for her. The milkman, Thomas Venn, had delivered his round 2 hours late, yet claimed he'd finished early and come to Mass for the first time in months. 3 possible faces, 3 tangled alibis, and 1 blood-stained glove. Father Brown held it late into the night, staring at it as if it might speak. It didn't, but something else did. He recalled a moment, brief, flickering, when the choir finished the final line. One person had not risen for the blessing. A man, still, head bowed, hands clenched. And now that he thought harder, yes, Thomas Venn. But there was more. Lucinda Sharp had confessed something strange to Father Brown just 2 weeks ago. Not in detail, not clearly, but she had been afraid. "I've remembered something," she had said. "Something I shouldn't have seen." She never told him what it was. Now she never would. Unless the killer knew she'd spoken. Unless that was why she was killed. Father Brown returned to the chapel. There, he found what he didn't expect. Another glove. This one placed neatly on the lectern. Identical. Also stained. It wasn't guilt anymore. It was a message. "I'm still here." And Father Brown knew he was being watched. He tested a theory. He announced in Sunday's sermon that the police had recovered a footprint outside Lucinda's home, and they were close to finding the killer. It was a lie. But the reaction was real. Thomas Venn didn't flinch. Mrs. Delaney dropped her rosary, and Mr. Hargreaves, he walked out halfway through the sermon, face white. That night, someone broke into the rectory. They didn't steal anything, but they left something, a note, written in looping, elegant script. "You preach salvation, but you cannot save her now." The next morning, Mrs. Delaney was found unconscious in her shop. Poison tea. She survived, but barely. When she woke, her first words were, "I know who it was, but I can't say it." She died that evening. Father Brown was alone now. The police were useless. They saw only deaths. He saw patterns. He dug through old confessional records, church seating logs, flower delivery schedules, tiny things that no one else would have bothered with, and he saw the pattern. Lucinda, Mrs. Delaney, Mr. Hargreaves, all three had served on the church council in 1949, the year the parish finances mysteriously disappeared, the year a homeless man was found dead behind the chapel, beaten, unclaimed, forgotten. There had been no investigation. The church roof had been repaired shortly after. Father Brown found the old journal, the old priest's notes. One line stood out. 3 know what happened. 1 was too young. He might remember. One day. The young one? A boy then. A man now. Thomas Venn, the milkman, born in the village, raised by his aunt, Lucinda Sharp, the same woman who died first, because she remembered, because she told him, and he couldn't live with it. Father Brown now knew the truth, but he couldn't prove it. So he set a final trap. He delivered a sermon about forgiveness, about blood, about gloves, and at the very end he paused, held out the 2 gloves for the congregation to see, and said quietly, "Only the man who wore them knows where the 3rd one is." Silence. Then a sound, a whisper of movement, and Thomas Venn stood, walked slowly to the altar, laid a 3rd glove on the steps, looked Father Brown in the eye, and said nothing. The police came, but the evidence was thin, circumstantial, and so he walked free. For now. But Father Brown saw it in his eyes. Not pride, not fear, but something worse. Peace. Because Thomas had wanted to be caught, had waited years for someone to notice. And only one man did. Father Brown. The man who knew the killer had sat in his church all along and did nothing until it was almost too late. Now, the pew sits empty. The glove still lies on the altar, and the candles flicker, as if remembering something no one dares say out loud. And when asked if justice was done, Father Brown only replied, "I know who did it, but the truth will never be told." Chapter 7. Father Brown's faith was tested. He opened the tabernacle, expecting the Blessed Sacrament, and found a dead man's tongue, wrapped in linen where the Eucharist should have been. That moment shattered something, not just in Father Brown's heart, but in the very marrow of Kembleford. Evil had walked into the holiest space in the village and replaced God's presence with mutilation. The altar was not just desecrated, it was defiled in a language only a murderer would speak. The man's identity was discovered within hours. Peter Mallory, the church's long-absent deacon, missing for a week. Officially, he'd gone to visit his sick mother in Shropshire. Unofficially, he had never left the village. Not alive, at least. His tongue, the very symbol of confession, prayer, and forgiveness, was removed and placed inside the most sacred vessel of the church. It wasn't just murder. It was a message, and it was meant for Father Brown. The bishop ordered an immediate investigation. Police swarmed the chapel. Parishioners wept and crossed themselves in the rain-soaked graveyard. But Father Brown did not flinch, because deep down, he already knew this was not the act of madness. It was personal. Someone wanted to see if his faith would break, if his belief in God's mercy could withstand a crime so cruel, so symbolic, that it made even forgiveness feel impossible. Peter Mallory had secrets. That much Father Brown suspected long before the tongue appeared. Peter had a past, an incident at a seminary that was never formally discussed, whispers of inappropriate letters exchanged with a student years ago, but nothing proven, nothing spoken aloud. Father Brown had seen the tremble in Peter's hands during benediction, the long stares at certain boys in the choir. He had hoped it was guilt, repentance. Now, he feared it had been anticipation, and if so, then the killer may have believed they were doing God's work. That idea alone chilled Father Brown to his core. The investigation unfolded slowly. There was no forced entry, no sign of struggle. The chapel had been locked that night from the inside, which meant the killer had keys, which meant the killer had trust. The sacristan, Mr. Blount, was interrogated first. He claimed to have left the church at 9:30 p.m. sharp, but his wife reported he hadn't come home until nearly midnight. His clothes were muddy, his hands scraped. He claimed he'd slipped on the path. Father Brown watched him closely during questioning. Blount kept adjusting his collar, eyes twitching every time someone mentioned the tabernacle. But guilt and murder were not always the same, and fear, Father Brown knew, could come from many sources. The choir director, Miss Allen, confessed she'd heard something that night. Chanting. Latin, Gregorian perhaps. She had returned to retrieve a forgotten satchel and passed the chapel around 10. She said the sound was beautiful, until it wasn't. Until she heard something else, layered beneath the chanting. A scream, muffled, sharp, then silence. She ran. She didn't tell anyone until now. And then there was the note. Father Brown found it folded inside the pulpit, addressed simply to the one who listens. The handwriting was crude, but deliberate, almost like a child's, but the message was anything but. He hurt the ones who came to him for salvation. I did what you couldn't. I did what God wouldn't. You speak of mercy, so show me some, or don't. The note was unsigned, but Father Brown recognized the ink. It matched the letters that had once been sent anonymously to the bishop, warning of spiritual rot in the village. Father Brown traced the paper, the type, the edge tears. He knew it came from the school supply cabinet, locked, supposedly, and only 3 people had access. Blount, Miss Allen, and someone else, James Cadwell, the altar boy, 14 years old, quiet, watchful, often invisible. Too invisible. Cadwell had been the one to ring the bell that night, even though no service was scheduled. The bell had chimed at 10:15 p.m., a strange hour. Father Brown hadn't heard it. No one had. But the rope bore fingerprints. Small ones, smudged by sweat. James had been there. But why? Father Brown called him in, alone. The boy sat rigid in the rectory chair, face pale, eyes locked on the floor. "Tell me what you saw," Father Brown said gently. James didn't answer. He only said, "You shouldn't have let him stay." Then he stood, walked out, left the door open behind him. That night, someone attempted to burn the confessional. A can of petrol, a match. But the flame went out before it spread, as if the very walls refused to burn. Father Brown stayed up until dawn, praying, for guidance, for courage. And then he remembered. Peter Mallory had once confessed something, half-spoken, half-swallowed. "I keep dreaming of flames," he had said, "of being locked in, and someone watching." Father Brown had thought it metaphor. Now he saw it as prophecy. Mallory had feared judgment. He just hadn't known it would come from someone who believed they were righteous. The next morning, the chapel was empty. No mass, no choir, just silence. Until the door creaked open and James Cadwell stepped inside. He walked to the altar, kneeled, and wept. "I did it," he whispered. Father Brown approached slowly. "Why, James?" He touched them, the little ones. He made them promise not to tell. But I saw, I knew, and I thought, maybe God wanted me to stop him. Maybe that's why I saw. Father Brown didn't speak. His heart was breaking, not just for the boy, but for the soul of the village. James looked up, eyes raw. "Did I sin?" Father Brown hesitated, then said quietly, "The act was sin, but the impulse came from pain, from a place where justice was denied." James nodded. "So what happens now?" Father Brown didn't answer, because he didn't know. That night, the bishop called, demanded names, demanded arrests, but Father Brown told him only this: the murderer is in God's hands now, and what was broken here can't be fixed with chains. He hung up and went to light a candle, for the dead, for the living, for the killer, and for himself, because in that moment, Father Brown knew his faith had not broken, but it would never be the same. Chapter 8. The secret buried with her. The coffin was empty, except for a letter addressed to Father Brown, sealed with the blood of the woman everyone thought was inside. No one in Kembleford had expected Eloise Durham to die. Even fewer believed she ever truly lived. Reclusive, silent, never seen outside the black curtains of Wintermere House, she was little more than a whisper wrapped in the fog. Yet when the obituary ran, typed, unsigned, and delivered to every doorstep in the village, no one questioned it. Not until Father Brown stood over the open grave and realized something horrifying. The casket was not only too light, it was completely wrong. No body, just a letter. And blood. He took the letter to the sacristy and opened it with trembling fingers. The first line shattered the silence. "They buried me alive once. Don't let them do it again." The signature, just one name. Eloise. But Eloise was supposed to be dead. Now, the questions screamed, louder than the bells. Who had faked her death? Why had the body vanished? And who, more chilling still, had written the obituary and arranged a public burial for a woman who may not have died at all? The villagers, of course, whispered the usual: madness, family shame, old sins. They said Eloise had been mad for years, that her family had kept her locked in Windermere House ever since the death of her sister Agnes. That death, 30 years ago, had also been a mystery. A drowning with no witnesses, a child with no coffin. Now it seemed the Durham women had a way of disappearing twice, once from the world and once from the truth. Father Brown made his way to Windermere that evening. The gates creaked open, like the mouth of a secret. The house was dim, but not empty. Eloise's brother, Geoffrey Durham, answered the door with a face far too calm. "Yes," Geoffrey said. "My sister passed last Tuesday, peacefully, in her sleep. The doctor certified it." "Father?" Brown asked. "And the body?" "Taken by the undertaker." "And the letter?" Geoffrey blinked. Just once. "I don't know what you're talking about." But Father Brown saw the twitch in his jaw, the way his eyes flicked toward the west wing, toward the door that was bolted from the outside. He didn't push further. Not yet. Instead, he walked the village. He spoke to the gravedigger, who admitted something strange. The coffin came sealed, already nailed shut. No weight to it. I just dug and lowered it. Thought it odd, but figured maybe it was illness, you know. Contagion. No illness had been reported. He questioned the doctor. "I never signed a death certificate," the man said firmly. "Not for Eloise. I haven't seen her in a decade, but someone forged it. Someone orchestrated a funeral for a body that never existed." The next morning, the housekeeper of Windermere, old Mrs. Flynn, was found drowned in the garden pond. The very same pond where Agnes Durham had drowned 30 years before. Her death was ruled accidental, but her hands were bloodied, her fingernails broken, and in her apron pocket was a second letter. Same handwriting, same seal. "She tried to stop me, just like Agnes did." Father Brown's blood ran cold. Agnes had tried to stop someone. Mrs. Flynn had tried to stop someone. Someone who was still alive. Someone who now walked through Windermere House, unseen, unheard, and unburied. He returned to the manor under cover of darkness. He slipped past the library, past the music room, toward the bolted door in the west wing. And he listened. A faint tapping, then a whisper. 3 words, over and over again. "Not yet dead." He unbolted the door. Inside was a room without windows. No lights, a cot, a cracked mirror, and walls covered in hundreds of pages, all handwritten, all by the same woman. Eloise. She hadn't died. She'd been imprisoned. For decades. She stared at him with hollow eyes. "You're late," she said. "They're going to bury me for real next time." Father Brown stepped inside. "Why?" She handed him a final letter. It contained everything. Agnes had discovered something. Their father had been poisoning village girls. Eloise had tried to stop him. Agnes had told the housekeeper, Mrs. Flynn, but Geoffrey, loyal to their father, drowned Agnes, then told everyone she fell in. Eloise refused to stay silent, so Geoffrey made her vanish too, alive. Now 30 years later, Mrs. Flynn tried to reveal the truth. Geoffrey silenced her again, but Eloise had written letters, dozens. Only one had reached the outside. To Father Brown. He took her from that place. He handed the letters to the police, but Geoffrey had vanished. Just like the body, just like the truth. And Father Brown stood at the graveyard once more. The coffin still empty, only now. He knew why. But when asked if justice was done, Father Brown only said, the secret wasn't buried with her. He looked at the gravestone. It read, Eloise Durham, 1890 to 2023. And under it, carved just recently, I was always here. Then he walked away into the fog, whispering, I know who did it. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 9. Only silence answered his question. The girl was still breathing when Father Brown found her curled beneath the altar. But by the time he asked her name, she had already chosen silence over truth. Her eyes were wide with terror, her lips blue, her hands clutching something that wasn't hers. A rosary too old, too blood-stained, and far too cursed to belong in a modern church. Father Brown touched her shoulder gently. Who did this to you? He whispered. But she only blinked, once, twice, then closed her eyes forever. Kembleford had seen crimes before, but never one that struck so surgically at the heart of faith. This girl, unidentified, unclaimed, almost ghostly, in her thin white gown, had crawled into St. Mary's under cover of night and died in the holiest place of all. There was no sign of struggle, no forced entry, just her body, the rosary, and an overwhelming scent of incense and rain. Father Brown felt it at once. This was not a murder born of rage. This was ritual, chosen, symbolic, and whoever left her there wanted him to see it. He examined the rosary first. The crucifix had no Christ. Its figure had been scraped off, erased by blade or nail. The beads, 13 instead of 10, were made of black stone, but one was red, blood red, and warm. Impossible. He turned it in his fingers. The chain had a small inscription etched into the clasp, nearly invisible without magnification. It read, Veni Silentium, come silence. The girl had come seeking sanctuary, but she had died with secrets still locked behind her teeth. The authorities couldn't identify her. No local match, no missing persons alert, nothing. But her fingerprints, one smudged on the side of the altar, matched prints taken from a previous crime scene. A crime Father Brown had buried long ago. The murder of Ainsley Cray. 7 years earlier, found at the foot of the bell tower, throat slit, clutching a broken page. From an exorcism manual, case closed. The culprit, a mentally unstable monk named Brother Elric, had confessed and hanged himself before trial. But now, this new girl, this new rosary, it all suggested something that Father Brown hadn't wanted to consider back then. That Brother Elric had not lied. He had not been mad. He had been silenced. And now, silence had returned, to finish what it started. Father Brown visited the archives. He reviewed Elric's confession. Every word was filled with terror, dread, and devotion. I did not kill Ainsley, he'd written, but I heard the voice that ordered it. I obeyed only because I feared what would happen if I disobeyed the Silent One. Everyone thought it was religious mania, hallucination, madness. Now Father Brown wasn't so sure. That night, the church bell rang at 3:03 a.m. No one pulled the rope. Father Brown entered the bell tower and found a message carved into the wood just below the bell. She asked the wrong question, and that's when it struck him. The silence wasn't just death. It was protection. Anyone who spoke died. The next day, he asked the sexton about the girl. The man turned pale and replied, "Father, I've never seen her before. But Father Brown had barely finished his next sentence before the sexton collapsed, blood leaking from his ears. An aneurysm? Perhaps, or perhaps something else. Father Brown could no longer ignore it. This mystery wasn't just about murder. It was about something that preyed on faith itself, something that fed on fear and punished curiosity. And yet curiosity was all he had. He searched the confessionals. In one of them, deep beneath the floor matting, he found another scrap of paper. It was part of a journal, a page dated 1904. I hear it in the silence. Every time the church is empty, it answers no prayers, but it knows when someone speaks the truth. The page was unsigned. He took it to the diocesan archive. There, buried among old excommunications and baptism records, was a name. Far Ambrose Hale, pastor of Kembleford until 1905. Removed under mysterious circumstances, all notes sealed by church order. But one letter remained, a warning sent to the bishop. Seal the bell tower, burn the altar, tell no one what we found beneath the floor. The silence is not gone, it is only waiting. Father Brown returned to the church. At night, alone. He walked to the altar, lifted the floorboards. Beneath them, stone. Beneath that, hollow space. He lit a lantern and descended through an ancient crawl space. The air was thick, damp, choking with mildew and something else, something alive. At the far end of the tunnel, he found a chamber. A single chair faced the wall. On it, rope bindings, blood, teeth, and in the wall, scratched with nails, were hundreds of tally marks. Not numbers, names, every one of them a woman. Eloise, Agnes, Miriam, Lydia, Ainsley, and now the girl in white. Father Brown stumbled backward. Then he saw it, in the corner, a body, mummified, still wearing a priest's collar. A name tag fell from its chest. Far Ambrose Hale, not removed from the parish, murdered, entombed, left to rot in the silence. And now, someone was continuing what Ambrose had started. Only now, they were more careful, more methodical, more devoted. And Father Brown had dared to ask why. He returned to the surface at dawn. Everything felt colder, even the sunrise. As he entered the nave, he found one last letter on the altar. It wasn't addressed to him, just marked, "To the next one who asks." He opened it. Inside were only 4 words, "You should have listened." And that was the first time Father Brown feared he might not solve this mystery. Not because the answers weren't there, but because the answers, like the dead, refused to speak. Chapter 10. The candle revealed a killer. The flame should have gone out the moment the door slammed shut, but instead it flared to life, illuminating the murderer's face for the very first time. Father Brown had been in many places where death lingered in silence, but that night in the crypt beneath the church of St. Cyprian felt more like a deliberate trap than sacred ground. The air reeked of melted wax, blood, and secrets long buried, and at the center of it all, flickering on a rusted iron stand, stood one lone candle, unlit for over 50 years until something had just struck a match. The crypt hadn't been opened in decades, not since the fire of 1911. It was believed to be cursed, a place where voices echoed back wrong. Parishioners whispered that shadows moved even without light. But on that night, Father Brown had followed a trail of whispers, of half-spoken confessions, of a single desperate message scrawled in Latin and shoved under his door. Lux mentietur. Light will lie. The note was unsigned. But the moment Father Brown translated it, he knew exactly where he had to go, and he knew someone was watching. It had begun 3 days earlier, when young Henry Alcott collapsed during Mass. His eyes rolled back, his hands shook, and he cried out, "Forgive me, I saw her burn again." No one knew what he meant, except Father Brown, because just the night before, someone had broken into the vestry and stolen one item only, a blackened, half-melted candle sealed in glass. It had belonged to Sister Miriam Hartley, a nun who had perished in the 1911 fire. She had died, locked in that crypt, praying to the very end. Her last act had been to light that candle as the flames closed in. They found her hand fused to the brass candlestick. After that, the relic was preserved, sealed, and never lit again, until now. And now Henry Alcott was speaking in a voice that wasn't his, remembering a death that wasn't his, and bleeding from the ears before he could finish a single sentence. She saw who, then silence. No wounds, no trauma, only a pulse that stopped like someone had flipped a switch. Father Brown knew the signs. He had seen death arrive silently before. But this had ritual written all over it. The flame didn't just burn, it chose. The investigation twisted in on itself. No fingerprints, no suspects, except one clue, a single wax drip found on Henry's pillow that matched the composition of Sister Miriam's candle. Father Brown visited the hospital chapel where Sister Miriam's remains were once kept for veneration. The altar had been desecrated. The reliquary opened. Inside was nothing but ash and a folded piece of parchment. "Let her speak," it read. He didn't sleep for 2 nights. On the 3rd, he saw the girl. At the edge of the cemetery, pale, barefoot, long hair clinging to her nightdress, staring at him with wide, grief-heavy eyes. "The candle," she whispered. He thought it would show truth, but it only shows death. She vanished before he could ask her name. But her scent remained. Lavender. The same Sister Miriam had worn. The next evening, Father Brown returned to the church after hours. Something compelled him, not fear, not faith, but something more primal. Dread. The crypt's iron door was ajar. He stepped in, and the candle lit itself. That's when he saw the figure, half shrouded in shadow, bent at the altar where Miriam's bones once lay. A voice, smooth as silk, whispered, "You've come too far, priest." Father Brown didn't flinch. "The candle reveals what cannot be seen by sunlight. That's why you lit it." A chuckle. "No, Father. I lit it so I could see her again. She showed me what she saw before she died. And I saw him. I saw what he did. I saw the killer." Father Brown took a step forward. "Who did she see?" The voice answered, "You." Everything in the room pulsed once. "No," he whispered. But something in the candle flickered, and for a split second he saw himself, not as he was now, but as he had been in 1911, a young man running down the corridor during the fire, hearing screams from behind the crypt door, and stopping. He hadn't unlocked the door. He had hesitated, not because he was cruel, but because he was afraid. That delay had sealed Miriam's fate. He fell to his knees, and the flame began to dim. "That was your confession," the voice said. "But I am not here to absolve you. I am here to finish what she began." Father Brown looked up. "Then you already know who truly killed her." The figure stepped into the light. It was Sister Miriam's niece, Eleanor Hartley, now grown, now pale, and very calm. "You lied to everyone." They said she died a martyr, but she died screaming, because you didn't act. I knew the candle would show you. I knew it would show him too. Father Brown frowned. Who? She held up a photograph. It was of the church's founding bishop, Reverend Bishop Alcott, Henry's grandfather, the same man who had sealed the crypt, the same man who had ordered that the door remain closed until the end of days. Father Brown whispered, "He locked her in." Eleanor nodded. She refused to follow his orders. He told her she'd gone too far. That faith should be silent, obedient. She refused. But why did Henry die? Because I needed the candle to choose. You used him. No, she did. Through me. Father Brown felt the temperature drop. The candle flickered violently, then darkness. When it returned, Eleanor was gone, and in her place, another candle stood burning, identical to the first, with another name etched into the base, Father Brown. He picked it up. Underneath, a date was carved, tomorrow. And in that moment, he realized something chilling. The candle didn't reveal the killer. It revealed the next one to die. Chapter 11. Everyone lied to Father Brown. The woman who screamed was already dead by the time Father Brown opened the door, and everyone in the room swore they'd never heard a thing. It had been one of those still, oddly dense evenings in Kembleford, the sort that pressed against the chest and made even the church bells sound distant, strangled, half-hearted. Father Brown had returned from the cemetery earlier than expected. He had gone to read a private burial prayer for Mrs. Calloway, the late spinster, whose death everyone had agreed was natural, though not one soul could describe exactly how. But as the priest stepped into the darkened nave of St. Mary's, he felt something deeper than silence waiting for him, something that wasn't holy, something hiding in the hush. That scream, he was sure it came from inside the vicarage. The door was locked from the inside. There were no broken windows, and yet when he broke in, shattering the latch with the brass base of his umbrella, he found young Elsie Drummond lying sprawled beneath the grandfather clock, eyes wide open, a look of sheer, impossible terror frozen across her face. The doctor said it was a heart attack, but Father Brown had seen a shadow near the organ loft move just as he'd entered. And when he checked the confession booth later, he found a damp handkerchief with a smear of blood, too fresh for the dead girl to have left behind. That was yesterday. Today, everyone in the village was lying. They lied about who'd seen Elsie last. They lied about what she'd been doing before she died. They lied about whether she'd gone into the vicarage at all. And worst of all, they lied with the ease of people who were afraid not of guilt, but of being noticed. She had no enemies, said Miss Hargrave, who had called Elsie a climbing, two-faced harlot barely a week ago in the post office queue. She never came near the vicarage, insisted Leonard Fielding, whose hand, Father Brown had personally seen reaching out to brush hers behind the flower stall. And when he asked about the bloodied handkerchief, the vicarage maid, Ivy, had the nerve to say, "Must have been yours, Father. Maybe you cut yourself and forgot." Forgot? He hadn't even shown them the cloth. That night, Father Brown sat alone in the chapel with the candles burning low, each one casting a trembling halo. His Bible lay closed on the pew beside him, unopened since Elsie's death, not because he lacked faith, but because the words would not be enough if everyone refused the truth. Everyone was lying, even people who shouldn't lie, especially those. A mystery built on murder was one thing, but a mystery where everyone participated in denying its pieces, that was blasphemy in human form. It was as though the devil had decided not to tempt a single soul, but had taken root in the very bones of the town, whispering not to kill, but to cover. The next day, Father Brown walked to the manor on the hill, Grantham House, where Elsie had worked part-time cataloguing books for the reclusive Colonel Winstanley. It had rained again in the early morning, and the hedges glistened with spider threads and the muddy remnants of disturbed earth. The smell of turned soil and wet stone filled the air, something that always made Father Brown nervous. It was a scent too close to the grave. "Colonel Winstanley is not seeing visitors," said Mrs. Thurber, the housekeeper, but her face tightened when Father Brown produced the handkerchief. He didn't say a word. He didn't have to. She let him in. In the study, the colonel was seated with a chessboard in front of him. No opponent in sight. Pieces mid-play. A rook toppled, as if recently struck. "You've come about Elsie," he said calmly, without looking up. "I've said all I have to say." Father Brown studied the board. "You were losing," he murmured. "I beg your pardon." "You're losing, Colonel. That rook was protecting your queen." Winstanley paused, then looked up, slowly. Not many noticed that. Father Brown's eyes narrowed. "Elsie did. She mentioned it to me once after service. Said you played poorly when you drank. That got a reaction." A muscle twitched in Winstanley's cheek. "So? She also told me someone was blackmailing her. That someone knew about a letter she found tucked in the pages of your 19th century catalogue. She wouldn't say more, but she was frightened. She was dramatic," Winstanley spat. "She died with her mouth open in horror," Father Brown said gently. "That is not drama, Colonel. That is truth. And truth, I've found, makes liars uncomfortable." Silence followed. Then the colonel laughed once, bitter and strange. She didn't know what she found. It wasn't meant for her. What was it? "A confession," he whispered, almost reverently, "from a man long dead. A suicide note of sorts. May I see it?" Winstanley stood, walked to the fireplace, lifted the iron poker, and jabbed at the ash. "You can, if you like, digging through the past." Father Brown stared at the blackened cavity. The letter was gone, or perhaps it had never existed. He left Grantham House with more questions than he'd arrived with. That evening, Ivy, the maid, was waiting for him at the back door of the vicarage. "I didn't want to lie," she said, eyes red-rimmed, "but he made me." "Who did?" "Mr. Fielding. He told me if I said Elsie had gone in, he'd tell the parish council about my brother." "Your brother?" "He was arrested. In Portsmouth. Theft. But he's trying to turn his life around. If the council knew, if you knew, I'd lose everything." Father Brown exhaled slowly. "You lied to protect the living. But Elsie, she is dead, child." "I know," Ivy whispered. "That's why I have to show you something." She pulled a small folded slip of paper from her apron. "I found this in Elsie's hymn book. She always marked the same passage over and over again." Father Brown unfolded it. "When men say peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them." Scripture, but also a warning, a confession. In the only language she had left. "She knew she would die," he murmured. "No," Ivy said. "She knew someone else knew. That's what frightens me. She told me 2 nights ago. I saw something in the church I shouldn't have. I saw someone who doesn't belong." "Who?" Father Brown asked. "She didn't say, but she asked me to keep the hymn book somewhere safe. I only remembered after she died." That night, as the storm broke above the village, Father Brown sat again, alone in the church. Candles flickered, the pews stood empty, but his mind was crowded, with voices, motives, lies, half-truths. He thought about the chessboard, about blackmail, about fear, about how no one had heard her scream. But someone had, and that person had made sure no one else ever would. He walked to the confessional, stepped inside, closed the door, and then, very softly, he whispered, "You came here. I know you did. You left blood on the wood. You hid behind these veils while a young woman died 10 feet away." The silence that followed was almost holy, but not quite. He turned, and on the wall behind the booth, half hidden in shadow, was something new, a word, carved deep into the wood, fresh, liar. The next morning, Miss Hargrave was gone, left without a trace, her cottage abandoned, her belongings scattered, as though packed in a hurry. Father Brown found a photo inside her Bible, a group photograph from a church retreat 5 years earlier. Elsie, Ivy, Leonard Fielding, Colonel Winstanley, himself, and one face circled in red ink, a face he didn't recognize, a man standing beside Elsie, his hand too tight around her waist. Behind the photo, another note, this one written in frantic, blotched handwriting. "He's still here." That was the moment Father Brown finally sat down, hands trembling, not from fear, but from knowing. He knew who had been in the confessional, who had scared Elsie into silence, who had made everyone lie, not out of loyalty, but terror. The pieces were all there. The question wasn't whether he could prove it. It was whether the truth would ever be safe enough to speak aloud. He stared into the flame of a candle, steady and still. "I know who did it," he whispered, eyes fixed on the carved word behind the veil. But the truth will never be told. Chapter 12. His last sermon unmasked the killer. No one knew the bloodstain was still there, hidden beneath the pulpit floor where the altar boy had found it, long after the last amen was whispered. But Father Brown had known it all along, and this Sunday he chose a sermon that would make the killer bleed again. The morning light through the stained glass of St. Mary's bathed the nave in eerie hues, blue like bruises, red like wounds. Outside, the bells tolled gently through the mist-drenched air. But inside the church, something heavier than sound was stirring. Every breath was tight, every glance sharper. There were no visitors this time, only the villagers who had come out of habit, out of guilt, or out of fear. Father Brown stood at the front, still and expressionless. His cassock hung like shadowed armor, and the Bible he held wasn't the one he normally used. This one had been found in the belongings of a murdered girl, one the village refused to mourn. He turned the pages slowly, but he wasn't reading. "The sermon this morning," he said, voice quiet but resonant, "is about truth, and what happens when it dies screaming and no one listens." 3 people visibly flinched. Mrs. Hargrave's gloved fingers clenched over her hymnal. Leonard Fielding stared too long at the stained glass St. Peter. And in the back, Colonel Winstanley lowered his head, but didn't close his eyes. Father Brown didn't speak of scripture. He didn't quote parables. He told a story of a village where a girl found something she wasn't meant to see. A girl who had loved once, perhaps unwisely, and trusted even more unwisely. A girl who, in the end, screamed, but no one answered. Not because they didn't hear, but because they chose silence. And someone in that room, one person, had killed her to keep it that way. He watched their faces, the tiniest twitch at a particular word, the held breath when he said confession, the swallow when he mentioned a letter burned in a fireplace, the eyes that refused to blink when he spoke of a man who prayed after committing murder. Then Father Brown said something that made time itself seem to hesitate. She did not die alone. She died with a hand over her mouth, a strong one that had shaken my own in this very church. Gasps broke out across the pews. Some covered their mouths, others sat rigid, but one man got up, quietly, calmly. Colonel Winstanley. He did not run, he did not shout, he simply walked toward the door, as if he were late for a meeting he'd already decided not to attend. "Sit down," Father Brown said, but the colonel didn't stop. Until the door refused to open, Ivy, the maid, stood outside, hand gripping the latch, eyes wide, as if her presence was the only thing keeping the door from opening to whatever waited beyond it. The colonel turned slowly. "You have no proof," he said. "Only stories." Father Brown stepped down from the pulpit. Each step echoed. "No," he said, "I have a sermon. One that tells of a man who believed he was above guilt. But guilt, like God, watches from every shadow." "I burned the letter," Winstanley spat. "And yet," Father Brown said, raising his hand, "Elsie made another copy, hidden in the lining of her Bible." The room went still. "She left it with Ivy, just in case." He handed the paper to the constable seated near the front. Constable Darnley, who had never trusted the colonel's alibi. The colonel laughed once, low and bitter. "So what will you do? Arrest me on the word of a dead girl?" "No," Father Brown said softly. "I will forgive you. But the law will do what it must." And yet even as the constable rose and placed his hand on the colonel's shoulder, something shifted in the church, a terrible stillness, a doubt, because in that moment someone else stood up. Leonard Fielding. "That letter," he began, face pale, trembling. "That letter was mine. I wrote it, not him. It was a lie. I was trying to protect her." The room erupted. Gasps, shouts, confusion. The constable looked from one man to the other. Father Brown didn't blink, didn't move. "Why now?" he asked Leonard quietly. "Because you were about to arrest the wrong man," Leonard cried. "Or," Father Brown said, stepping toward him, "you saw your last chance to muddy the waters, one final time, to confuse truth with a different kind of lie." "I loved her," Leonard shouted. "Ask Ivy. Ask anyone." "I have asked," Father Brown said, "and everyone has lied." Then he turned back to the congregation. But not anymore, because just then a soft voice, shaking but steady, rose from the back. It was Ivy. "I saw him," she said. "That night, I saw Mr. Fielding leave the church. And Elsie? She was already on the floor." Fielding turned pale. "She trusted you," Ivy whispered. "And you." "I loved her," he roared. "I loved her, and she was going to ruin everything. She found the letter. She said she'd go to the bishop." He froze. Too late. The whole room was silent again. The confession was complete. Fielding dropped to his knees. "I didn't mean to," he sobbed. I meant to scare her. I never thought she'd fall like that." The constable stepped forward, but Father Brown raised a hand, walked slowly to the man, knelt beside him. "You did not fall into sin," he said. You climbed into it, step by step, with your eyes wide open. Fielding wept, and as he was led out, the congregation remained frozen. Father Brown stood, turned, and walked back to the pulpit. And that, he said, voice low, is why truth matters, because lies don't just bury the dead, they kill the living. Then he closed the Bible, and the candle behind him flickered once, brighter than before. In the end, no one applauded, no one spoke. The church emptied in silence, and Father Brown remained, eyes closed, lips moving in a silent prayer. "I know who did it," he whispered, "and now, so do they."